Hello, I'm Christopher Lloyd of the Film Yap, and we're back here for another podcast, joined with some other members of the film critic community here in Indiana, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Lou, why don't you start?
Hi, Lou Harry. I write for Midwest Film Journal and any other outlet that will have me. My anchor job is with the Society of Professional Journalists, editing their magazine Quill.
And Adam?
Hi, I'm Adam Aasen. I live in Carmel, not too far from Chris. If you hear a little girl, this is Madeline, my daughter. She's hanging out with me and loves the movie screen. I write for the Film Yap and a website called gradeamovies.com. And I'm a former newspaper reporter, so I understand what these guys have go through with journalism.
All right. And yes, I've got my kids at home here today as well. So we're just going to have a little bit of background as always. But we want to talk today about it's getting up to the award season, Golden Globes, Oscars, all that kind of stuff. And we had a great Facebook discussion going amongst us about Oscar winners for Best Picture that we have seen the most times. And then that kind of got into other things of, which movies do we think other general people, like what would be the number one Oscar winner for Best Picture that has been rewatched the most times, and or what lends themselves to rewatching and what doesn't. So Luke, why don't you just kick it off? Like, what would you say is the Best Picture winner that you personally have seen the most number of times, and then maybe the one you think in general, just counting the whole populace, what would be number one?
Wow. Big questions. First, I want to make sure that anyone listening understands we're not saying that should necessarily be a criteria for a Best Picture. There are great movies that I only want to see once, and that doesn't diminish the quality of the films. Probably personally for me, Casablanca is probably the most watched. I've introduced that to a number of people, discovered it myself, watched it in film school, did all of the, and have watched it strictly for pleasure. Saw it on a wonderful double feature once with The Year of Living Dangerously, which was a nice combo. And the length of the film, its sort of anchoring piece in history, and just how damn entertaining it is makes it a very rewatchable film. I think the one that was probably most rewatched is probably Sound of Music, just because of it became such a yearly staple back in the days before Netflix and HBO, and even beyond that, it's still a go-to film for a lot of people. So I think those two. That would be my personal one, and the one I think that is most rewatched.
Okay, Adam, what about you?
Well, first off, before we get into the ones that are the least rewatched, it's probably going to be ones that weren't even good on the first viewing, and we'll get into that in a second. I actually recently, during quarantine, made it a goal to watch all of the Best Picture winners that I had not seen before, and there were some gems in there that I kind of surprised I never saw. One that Chris Lloyd said was one of his favorite movies ever, The Bridge on the River Kwai. I had never seen that. Finally got around to watching that. Some of the older ones are a little harder to watch, like Cavalcade and The Life of Emile Zola and Broadway Follies. Those are ones where you might have been folding some laundry while you're watching them. But here's the interesting thing. For me personally, I have kind of an unusual Best Picture winner that I've seen the most times. I don't know if either of you can guess, but it's one of my favorite movies, 1960s.
1960, is that The Apartment?
The Apartment.
Wow.
I've seen The Apartment. I probably watch it once a year.
Mm-hmm.
Big Jack Lemmon fan, big Billy Wilder fan. And Billy Wilder, it's his second Best Picture winner. He also won for The Lost Weekend. That's in the years earlier in the 1940s. But I think it's a great screenplay that holds up. And so that's the one I've watched the most. I agree that The Sound of Music for most people, I think Lou also mentioned on the Facebook feed that The Return of the King by the Lord of the Rings trilogy, definitely up there. That's something that people have rewatched time and time again. Two others that personally I've seen quite a few times would be Rocky, Best Picture winner, and I'm sure that's true for a lot of people, and The Silence of the Lambs. That's one that it's an easy rewatch. It's great performances in that. and especially if you're doing a rewatch of all the Hannibal Lecter movies, they're not all as good as Silence of the Lambs. Some of them are pretty terrible,
Yeah.
but it's fun to rewatch them all, especially if you get into the TV show and the book series. I actually read all of those books. I did not finish Hannibal Rising, the one that was written just because they threatened him, Thomas Harris, saying, hey, if you don't write this book, we're going to make a movie about his origin regardless. And it may not be a good movie, and it wasn't, but at least you can get paid for it if you write this book that has to deal with it.
Yeah.
I think Godfather would be another one that would
Yeah.
be pretty often rewatched. I doubt that Godfather 2 is watched, as terrific of a film as it is. I doubt if it's rewatched nearly as much as Godfather.
Yeah, Godfather would probably be my number one in terms of number ones that I personally have seen the most number of times. But there's probably a lot of them in there. There's more popular ones like Rocky and so forth, where just through happenstance, or I'm watching it with family or friends or back in the day. I will say, in terms of rewatching, I can pretty much chart my level of rewatching by right around the time my first child was born, 11 years ago now. Because before then, I loved to rewatch movies. Any movie that I saw and really liked, at some point I would rewatch it, and not so much anymore. So like, I've got the list of Best Picture winners here, and pretty much starting right around 2010, 2009, 2010. Those were the films that I, probably only saw one time when they came out in theater, including a lot of ones lately in the last 10 or 15 years that I just wasn't that I just didn't disagree with it winning Best Picture, but I actively loathed the movie. Birdman probably being a great example of just you would have to pay me a substantial cash amount to get me to watch that again.
That's a different one of the things that's interesting there. You mentioned, I think there are a lot of films this decade and more recently that are that one shot watch. I think Shape of Water is another one like that.
Yeah.
I think, and it's interesting looking at them. Not that a decade is, a definitive, beginning and end point, but you look at, like you mentioned, The Apartment in the 60s. I mean, the 60s, four of the best pictures were musicals. And I think musicals, for a while at least, tended to have more of a rewatchability because it's easier to sort of zone in and out of them. There's a secondary level of pleasure beyond following the plot, engaging with the characters, engaging with the narrative. There's also just listening to it. And I think that built up some of the rewatchability then. It may not be as much of the case anymore since we haven't had particularly good musicals, but at least ones that have been in the Best Picture realm.
Yeah.
Chicago being the last one, which I think has a fair amount of rewatchability.
Yeah.
I would argue too that some of the films that you're talking about the musicals of their Best Picture watchability. There's some of them that were maybe really rewatchable at one point, but now they have not aged very well. I would put in there Kramer versus Kramer feels very dated. Driving Miss Daisy feels a little uncomfortable now with the white lady kind of saving this black guy who's driving her around the whole time. And for many reasons, Annie Hall is not as fun to rewatch as it once was, depending on your changing feelings about Woody Allen. Right. So yeah, times change. There are ones that people who watched Gone with the Wind now that had never seen it growing up may say, one, what's the big deal? Why is this considered one of the greatest films ever? And two, the times have changed a little bit. Gone with the Wind.
I just watched Gone with the Wind for the first time about a year and a half ago. I'd never actually sat down and watched it. And I found it really interesting because I wasn't expecting the main character, to be that despicable. Yeah. And, you look at, and I think part of that is intent. That's not just time doing that. And I think it's interesting, looking at whether films with not particularly relatable or rooting for main characters become more rewatchable or less. I'm not sure.
Yeah, another one hasn't aged well as West Side Story, which of course Steven Spielberg is remade, and we'll be seeing that I think later this year. Which people forget, when that movie came out, I mean, that was really considered like cutting edge, daring, looking at, urban conflict and racial conflict and all these things going on in the big cities. And it looks just quaint now with, the worst thing that can happen to you is somebody would pull a switchblade on you.
Well, part of the interesting thing with West Side Story that a lot of people don't realize is the musical itself on stage did not do particularly well. It was not a blockbuster hit on Broadway. It did okay, but the movie and the number of sales of that soundtrack are what really put that into the popular consciousness.
I rewatch West Side Story because of the music and the songs, because it's so fantastic. The story and the characterizations and everything, not so much. So speaking about some of those other movies that maybe don't lend themselves to rewatchability, one you guys mentioned, one of my favorite films actually of the 90s was The Silence of the Lamb. Just a transformative movie experience for me. I remember sitting in the theater. It really doesn't, I think, lend itself to as many rewatching, just because even though it's a great movie with great acting, great stories, a lot of stuff going on there, it is, to a large extent, a crime procedural. And, it's a lot about revelations of the plot and surprises and twists and things like that. And once you've kind of been down the maze the first time, the rewatching that does lose some allure to it. Can you guys?
That's a very good point. I don't think there are any other. I'm trying to see if there are any other real sort of mysteries or whodunit winners, even in the past 30 or 40 years. There aren't many. We pretty much know what's going to happen to Gandhi. You know what I mean? It's not big revelations there.
The 50s and 60s was an interesting period for the Best Picture winners, because it really seemed to clang back and forth between like really popular films, musicals, spectacles just for the pure entertainment, and really dark and gritty movies winning Oscars for Best Picture. So I mean, 1954, 1955. So we had From Here to Eternity, On the Waterfront, and Marty. Just three really good grim movies, bookended by An American in Paris, The Greatest Show on Earth, and Around the World in 80 Days, which are very, very light, fun movies, musicals, or whatever.
And Gigi in the mix there too.
Yeah, Gigi in the mix, Ben-Hur, and then the 60s, of course, you've got, like you say, The Sound of Music and Olivier in with Midnight Cowboy and Tom Jones and Lawrence of Arabia. So it's always fun to see what films climb to the top of the heap. So any other thoughts, Adam, about films that Best Picture winners that you've seen that you just don't think lend themselves to rewatching very well?
Well, there's ones that are, first I'll say the ones that are good that aren't great for rewatching. Schindler's List, I've rewatched I've seen probably 3 times in my life, which is unusual considering how great a film it is. I would consider Schindler's List maybe one of the top 10 greatest films of all time. One second, she's playing like crazy.
Yeah. Well, for one of those screenings, you were just playing a drinking game during it, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, Schindler's List to me, one of the top 10 greatest films ever, but I wouldn't necessarily say I'd watch it again and again and again, because it's long and it's not the happiest subject matter. Yeah, then there are films, Gandhi, incredibly long, not as easy to rewatch. Then there are films that after you finish watching, you're like, okay, that was okay, but I don't think I'd ever want to watch that again. There are some Best Picture winners I watched recently that I thought, man, how did that win? Out of Africa was one that was incredibly boring to me. The English Patient, and one that other people love that I just was not into was Chariots of Fire, and Tom Jones. Tom Jones was supposed to be this comedy, and I don't think I caught myself laughing once. I appreciate British humor, but that one just did not do it for me.
And I think if you had a whole room full of people talking about the Oscars and they talked, as long as, if they talked for a week about movies, the artist would never come up.
Yeah. That's another perfect example. I liked it the first time I saw it. It's probably the same with Argo too, where I liked these films. I don't think I've rewatched The Artist or Argo.
Yeah, some films like that, even though it's a good movie or even a really good movie, sometimes they just don't linger. And I think that's the big issue with rewatchability, is some films really lend themselves to it, not like one film, not a Best Picture winner, but one that I rewatch from time to time and really speaks to me in different ways is Castaway with Tom Hanks. And every time I rewatch that movie, I take away something new from it. And so that's one that I've rewatched, not a ton, but probably, I've probably rewatched it like 7 or 8 times. And just in general, some movies really do that. Whereas, like, say, Parasite, really historical Best Picture winner, first foreign language film to win. Arguably, The Artist was a French movie just with subtitles, but whatever. I'm not sure if that's going to be a big rewatcher. I'm not sure if.
I think it will be, because I don't think people fully appreciated it sometimes on the first run through, and I think there's detail in there that emerge. I'm not a big rewatcher at all, but I think it has more to do with whether you either want to recreate a feeling that you had, and that's people watching Sound of Music and Titanic and and West Side Story, or do you think there is more stuff to mine from it, and that's Parasite and a load of other movies. I don't think you know the first, you mentioned Schindler's List. I wouldn't necessarily rewatch that. I wouldn't necessarily rewatch 12 Years a Slave, because I feel like I've had that experience and I get it and I admire it and it worked, and they're both great films, but they're not experiences that I want to necessarily go through again in that same way.
That's a
whereas other people watching, again, Sound of Music, or I'm not a big Titanic fan, but Titanic, people want to have the feeling that they had going through it. I don't want to have the feeling that I had going through 12 Years a Slave or Schindler's List again.
Yeah, I think you've exactly nailed it, Lou. I mean, for whatever movies are and can be as entertainment, as art, I do think primarily the ones that stay with us, it's about an emotional experience. And I think you're right that when people want to feel again that emotional experience that they had the first time, those are the Best Picture winners. Those are the films that they will watch again, versus one that's something like, Citizen Kane, which is a great, great piece of cinema. But do people really have an emotional connection to Citizen Kane? I don't really.
But that one follows under the second category of, do I feel like I'm going to get something out of it more than an additional experience? And
right.
With Kane, that has worked for me. I've seen Kane half a dozen times, and still every time I see it, I like it in a different way. That's not going to happen with Driving Miss Daisy. It's unlikely to happen with, The King's Speech.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because at the Oscars, we're deciding what the best movie that came out this year was. And it's kind of like when you draft someone out of the NBA or the NFL draft, you think this is the best person. And then 10 years go by and you're like, oh, actually, it was this one. That was the best one. And if you were to go back and redo it, there's a lot of films that won Best Picture that are good movies that will be forever maligned because they beat some film that is so much better. Dances with Wolves is a good movie, but it beat Goodfellas, which is a much better movie, and it won't live that one down. How Green Was Your Valley? It's a good movie. It's not Citizen Kane. And so you can go throughout the history and see that. But it's hard. That's why a lot of films that I think that win Best Picture, it's not saying this is the best movie forever that came out this year. They're saying, for this period of time, this is what people felt really encapsulated the moment of the year. And that's why I think Parasite won, because of the multicultural facet. Having a foreign film win last year, I think, was important for the times. That's why a lot of films that are political and have something to do with what's going on at that moment end up winning, because they reflect what's going on. If we were going to say rewatchability was the standard for the best movies, then we would say that Back to the Future or Caddyshack were some of the greatest films ever made. And
Wizard of Oz would be in the discussion.
Yeah, it would be.
I think there's not that much of there's not a homogeny to the voting block either. There are some who think the award is for something that furthers the art. There's another that feels like it's the one that typifies the best of the art. There's another that is the most comfortable, or as you mentioned, the one that's the most telling of the time, that sort of captures the moment. And some people are just not paying attention and, voting for their friends. I mean, it's what should win. Every year a certain batch of films sort of emerge as the ones that should be considered, and they become part of the discussion. And other sometimes equally strong or stronger films, just for whatever reason, marketing is a big part of it. People forget that the studios throw their weight behind certain films. That has an influence on whether a film or an actor or a script gets nominated. It's harder for a film that doesn't have the weight of a studio pushing it to get behind it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks, guys. We're going to wrap it up there. Appreciate the discussion. Always fun to talk about what wins Best Picture and why we all love the movies in different ways that we do. So thanks very much, guys.
No pleasure. Be well.